You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. May the 4th be with you. This week, my good friend Jeff Munowitch is joining the show to talk about Star Wars. We talk about the top 5 transportation modes and our top 5 cities in a galaxy far, far away. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our wonderful Patreon supporters, past, present, and future. We really can't thank you all enough for the support, whether you've supported for a month or over 5 years. Join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards and support Talking Headways and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. $2 a month gets you stickers, including our Cars Are Cholesterol sticker and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Thanks everyone from the advocates to the bus drivers that support this show. Go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire to support. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. You can also get our transportation scarves, sign up for our daily newsletter started in 2006, or get our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning and Practice by going to theoverheadwire.com. Also, in the show notes, you'll find links to the bookshop.org affiliate store and link to purchase some of our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, designed with the great help of Richard Wazensky. Follow him on Instagram at DickDavidSketches if you get a chance. Thanks for all your support, and we look forward to sharing with you what's next. Well, Jeff Munowitch, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. Thanks for coming to the house. This is the first time I think I've recorded a show live at the house since before the pandemic. So thanks for coming over.
Yeah, I think there's something special to have podcasts in person.
So before we get started, this is going to be a little bit different episode than all the other ones just because this is focused on May the 4th. But I want to know a little bit about you, and I'm sure the listeners do, and maybe give us a little bit of your Star Wars cred as well.
Oh, man. Well, first, I'm Jeff Munowitch. I'm a software engineer. I work at a company called Populus that does transportation technology for transportation agencies. It's a really cool group of people, and there's a few Star Wars nerds within that group as well. So this actually isn't the first Star Wars conversation I've had in person in the last couple months, which is a little bit amazing. Kind of one of the first times in my life I really get that now. Because like when I started back in Star Wars, like I got, the original movies on VHS. And that's when I entered Star Wars and started to go into what is now known as the expanded universe with all the different books and all the different video games at the time. And I think video games also back in the day were really not online first. So there was a lot of single player and like play by yourself. So much of my first part of my Star Wars experience was just me.
Yeah.
So it's amazing in this current era to have a lot more like bringing everybody in.
It's funny, I didn't think about that because I read all the books kind of by myself late at night in my room, and I got the dictionaries, all of the background information, the art of books, all that stuff. But also the TIE Fighter game was like that big intro for me. That was like the thing that got me. I mean, the books in 1991 and So Heir to the Empire, all that stuff, we'll talk about that in a bit. But those got me in. But then it was the video games, the TIE Fighter and X-Wing. Because I think X-Wing came out maybe first and then TIE Fighter, but I
can't remember which the order was.
I think it was X-Wing and then TIE Fighter. But TIE Fighter was the one that really got me.
And then it was X-Wing versus TIE Fighter.
Yeah.
And then X-Wing Alliance. Yeah. So they started to bring in that online.
And then it just kind of exploded into LucasArts and Lucasfilm and all that stuff. They started just generating content like nobody's business after 1991.
Yes.
You thought it was over, but it really wasn't.
Kind of faked you out.
Yeah, it kind of faked you out. Well, so this is a special episode. We'll be airing on May the 4th, which is, fortuitous because I've been meaning to do this episode for a number of years, but it never really would have come out on a May 4th when we usually release the show on a Thursday. So this year, May the 4th is on a Thursday, which is really exciting. And May the 4th is typically recognized as Star Wars Day, I think, for fans and everybody else. And so what we're going to do is a top 5 cities and top 5 transportation modes of the Star Wars universe. And this can include any type of Star Wars IP, like we talked about, video games, books, comics, movies, TV shows, cartoons, all that stuff, anything. We'll just bring it out of the woodwork a little bit, which I promise that we will do. But hopefully it's something fun and a little different than usual Talking Headways, which I know everybody thinks is fun and exciting when you listen to the show. If you're listeners of the show, you like the show, I hope, anyways. But this is something a little bit different for May the 4th. And Jeff, I'm glad you're here to share this with me because I know that you are a huge Star Wars fan, just like me. We talked about it before. We've talked about it many times over beers and such, so I appreciate that. This is also a little bit of an homage to my favorite Star Wars podcast, which is called Force Center. They do top 5 lists all the time. And if you really want to go deep into canon and or non-canon or just characters and things like that, They're like top 5 weirdos. They have like top 5 bars in Star Wars, those types of things. You can go deep with those guys, but we're just going to do the urban issue focused transportation and cities. So with that being said, let's start with transportation. Of course, there's big things like hyperspace and Star Destroyers, which Darth Vader's was like 11 miles long, those types of things. But maybe we'll get into some of the stuff that folks who are deep into Star Wars will know, or if you don't know it, you'll learn something interesting and fun, or at least listen to us talk about it. But let's start with some honorable mentions. Munowitch, I'm going to give this to you as your first bonus one. What's your first bonus transportation honorable mention here?
So I'd say the first like transportation topic that I think of is on Coruscant. You have trillions of different vehicles flying around on the planet's surface. And you think of movies like iRobot, which has like a central thing that's managing all this traffic. And so that has to be happening on Coruscant. And they do have something called the Coruscant Traffic Control, which is supposed to be that. And it comes in and out of expanded universe. There's some canon in there, but basically an agency that's in charge to make sure everybody is getting to where they need to go and not crashing every single time. And so when you look at the movies, you kind of see all these little lanes of all these ships going by, but then also you get Anakin or, bounty hunters just flying randomly throughout. So I think that's a really interesting transport topic when you have a city that is basically the whole planet. How do you manage that at that scale?
And I never thought about that before, because in the movies, in the ones that feature Coruscant, the prequel trilogy, you have all these lines of buses and people's vehicles and stuff, and they are going at different altitudes. They are going in different directions. You have like little buses, but also people's individual vehicles. And so that's really interesting. I'm also thinking about when you're at the start of Revenge of the Sith, where the starfighters are starting to like kind of emerge on the other side of the pre-Star Destroyers. And you have the Venator class ships, and you have these, ships going everywhere. And I'm like, oh my God, this is like, how do you manage that? And then you go to the surface, and I'm sure it's even crazier. So there's just so much going on there. And I love that like sci-fi and fantasy like kind of allow us to imagine these things, right? Just think about what this would actually entail. And it might give us some ideas about how to manage drones or other things in the future, but that's it. Just kind of why I think Star Wars is so great, and science fiction and even science fantasy is so great as well.
Yeah, you can definitely see how the lessons that we can take away from Star Wars or Star Trek or any sort of science fiction and science fantasy really can be applied to our world.
Yeah. So my bonus one is also kind of something we might be able to take into the future. There's an episode called Bounty in season 4 of the Clone Wars, episode 20, if folks want to check it out. And it had an interorbital elevator in the cartoon, which basically you flew your ship to that elevator, and then it took you below the surface because of the gravity on the surface was too much for ships to handle. And actually, this is related to extended universe things called skyhooks. And they actually say that in Wikipedia, which I had to look it up. But they're like, yeah, it's the same thing as skyhooks. So they actually took something. They do this pretty often. They take something from the expanded universe and they kind of bring it into the main show, which we can have a discussion about that at some point. I know that you're a big EU fan. But I think that's really fascinating. And it kind of reminds me of these ideas that you'd always seen in like popular science or whatever about, space elevators where, you don't want to waste all that fuel just taking materials up and down into space when you could actually have this like elevator thing taking everything up, and thinking about how that might work in the future if we ever design our own shipyards up in space, those types of things. So something that we could actually replicate in the future, far future.
Far future. The future. I think the skyhooks or sky elevators is really interesting in Star Wars. They started it in expanded universe with the Emperor had a skyhook on Coruscant, and then the Dark Sun like mafia organization had one too above Coruscant. And that was like one of the ways you showed your wealth. In our world, the amount of energy it takes for something to get to orbit is actually really high. But in the Star Wars universe, it doesn't quite seem like that. So I wonder actually what the benefits is besides prestige, right? In your case, there is a benefit because the ships can't handle the gravity down there. But beyond that, it's like, what is the application there?
Yeah. Just that you can build a really long elevator.
Yeah. And also like the Star Wars universe is, you can think of it as infinite. So it has infinite resources that they can build it. I think that's one of the biggest things that prevents us. It's like we don't quite have the resources or quite the right tech to be able to make that happen yet.
Which is interesting. Infinite resources is something that's really fascinating, especially when you start thinking about asteroid belts and what you can mine and all those things. So obviously, like you said, we have finite resources, which makes it really hard to think of some of these things. But if you have infinite planets, basically, and infinite resources that you can strip mine, like in Andor, you have that situation going on. So interesting. Okay, so let's get into our top 5. Okay. We're going to go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'll go first and then give it over to you, and then you'll have the last laugh, as it were, in terms of what your transportation number 1 is.
Sounds great.
So my first is jetpacks. Jetpacks on troopers, jetpacks on Mandalorians, jetpacks everywhere. And they're showing up all over the place. But I just think, it's kind of interesting. It's kind of something that science fiction, science fantasy has been after for a long time, is just put a jetpack on a person and see what happens. And I guess in the real world, all we have is these like water packs where you have this jet of water that kind of shoots you up. Or some people I think have used, engines on their arms and things like that, but it doesn't last very long because you don't have enough fuel to go very far. But I just think that's interesting that, something gives power to these jetpacks on the Mandalorian. But, obviously it's some power that we haven't, found yet. It's not a lithium ion battery for sure.
No. Well, it's interesting that in my understanding of Star Wars canon, we've never actually encountered when a Mandalorian or a jetpack user ran out of fuel until very recently.
Right.
That was one of the first episodes with Mandalorian where they were chasing after the giant skybird, that they ran out of fuel. So we do know that fuel is limited on their jetpacks now, which was not necessarily something we knew. Honestly, it just seems like they're burning something, right?
Yeah. Or there's a fuel cell of some sort or something.
Doesn't seem that far-fetched from our current tech. Like tweak a little bit and then you can get there.
Yeah. I've often thought about energy in Star Wars, especially because, they've talked about it in Solo, right? You have the coaxium and those types of things that power ships and whatnot, and it's really valuable and rare. But then also you have like battery cells for like lightsabers. And I always wondered, like, do those run out eventually? It must in some way, but maybe the crystal enhances it or something. I don't know.
In the expanded universe, they did run out.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's ever quite made it into the modern day canon.
I don't know if I've seen that before. Yeah. Interesting. All right. What's your number 5?
So my number 5 is the levitation technology that they use for moving around cargo boxes and also land speeders. It's a very similar levitation tech. It seems to, keep you about half a meter or a quarter of a meter above ground. And, you can push it around relatively easily. So like, I don't know much at all about this tech. To me, this is like pretty black box setup. But like, why couldn't you use this for jetpacks? Is it like something related to the gravity of that planet you're on? Or I just don't know. So that's like, we're talking about limited power in jetpacks. These things can just stay hovering constantly.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't seem like there is a time where the turned off speeder sits on the ground.
Yeah. They never just kind of plops down.
Yeah. So why not for jetpacks? What's that reason?
Yeah.
I'm sure somebody out there in the Star Wars like fandom has a reason, right? Because that's one of the great things about Star Wars and the group of fans that it has accumulated after so many years is there are reasons somewhere.
Yeah.
Like everybody has.
Somebody said something. Yeah.
Yeah.
In the extended universe, they were called repulsor lifts. And I remember that they talked about them frequently in those first books, and going throughout, I think it was something that they picked up. But then after that, it just kind of disappeared as an explanation, because in the books you can explain more, obviously, right? But after that, I don't think anybody's ever really said repulsor lift in the canon or one of the main shows that they run. But I do know that's what they called them. And they use them for all kinds of things, right? But the boxes, I was thinking about the first and last mile, solutions for freight. Amazon could invent a repulsor lift or whatever, or whoever, Target or Walmart or whoever's delivering, UPS, FedEx, whatever. But that's a really cool one.
Yeah.
All right. What's your number 4?
Well, we're talking about transport techniques and we're thinking about ships and stuff like that. For me, Star Wars is space fantasy. So this idea that you can do things that obviously wouldn't work in our current world. So the Force dyad being used as a way to transport objects is something that's so unique and interesting to me, because like this basically didn't exist in the original Star Wars, and it's been introduced, and it just, to me, it's introduced so seamlessly. Like it fits in the lore really well. You can say what you want about the new, sequel movies, but I think this is one that really fits in well, this like talent. So passing a lightsaber through the Force dyad connection is just, it's not much. You're not transporting much, but it's pretty valuable. And it comes into, the original debate that I discovered with Star Wars. Is it science fiction or is it science fantasy? And to me, that's like, it is science fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes so much more of a lore and like storytelling thing that really becomes something you start to look into.
Yeah.
So that's why I had to pull in a transport technique that wasn't just like technology.
Yeah.
I really like that Force dyad setup.
I agree. It's interesting that you mentioned kind of that lore aspect of it, because if you think of like Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit or the hero's journey in general,
Yep.
It's not going to be realistic, but it's going to be something that brings you out of your world and makes you think differently about things. And I really appreciate that about Star Wars. And I think the whole thing about the Force generally, light side, dark side, the kind of themes of Star Wars generally, I think that really actually, and there's churches of the Force and stuff like that, but I actually just think that that can be used as ways to look at kind of light and dark in the world that we live in now. Some people take it one way and some people take it other ways. Some people think that, Luke should be aggressor versus a pacifist of sorts. And so you can have that debate over The Last Jedi or how, Rian Johnson took things. But I think that was interesting, the way that reflects into the universe that we live in now. Okay, my number 4 is ships that act like houses, which is a little funny. It's like a houseboat almost kind of thing, but it's not quite like an RV like Spaceballs makes fun of, right? But, there are tons of ships that characters use as houses. So the Millennium Falcon is kind of the primary example. Obviously, Han and Chewie use it as their home, but also, and they call it their home when they come back to it for that big Force Awakens kind of reveal. But also Lando in Solo, he had all of his capes stored in there. He had like a nice kind of place where he did his own video log, his own vlogging type of thing. So it's definitely something that I thought was kind of funny and fun. And also because people don't think about this very much, but when you're going around the universe in the Star Wars universe, time is weird, right? Like when you go through hyperspace, it might actually take you a week to get somewhere. It's not like you jump into hyperspace and then you're there in a couple seconds. It takes a long time. And so you might be sitting there for weeks on end in hyperspace going somewhere. So you need a place to sleep, which is why some of these single engine ships like the Mandalorian's N1's fighter is kind of weird to me. Like you're going to sit in the same like seat for like a week or two. That seems like it would be very, I don't know. You get some deep vein thrombosis real easily that way. But with these ships that often operate as houses as well, you have the kind of the benefit of having your home and you kind of hang out there for a few weeks while you're getting between planets. So you have the Ghost from the Rebels cartoon, which has some really cool character elevations as well. You have the ship from Bad Batch, which has been really cool lately. You have Luthen's ship from Andor, which he hides his countenance. Basically, he hides who he is in the ship. They have this really great scene where he basically changes himself from the rebel to the art dealer in like a couple of minutes as he's coming back.
He's getting into the zone on the ship. Yeah.
Really cool. So I don't know what you feel about house ships, but I thought that was kind of like a cool idea.
I mean, if you come back to the idea that Star Wars is basically a space Western, right? In that you are an individual person or thing or species in this galaxy, having your home be very mobile and with you makes a lot of sense, right? It's the outlaw on their horse out in the middle of the desert making camp where they are. It follows that paradigm. So it makes a lot of sense. It's totally it's great. I'm a little bit speechless by it because one of my top transports is one of those types of ships.
We'll get there.
It's just like so basic to what Star Wars is. And coming back to like snub fighters having hyperdrives on them, Luke did it in the original movies, right?
We went to Dagobah, you kind of just like hung out going to Dagobah for weeks.
In the expanded universe, he would just like fly around in his X-Wing. Like that was his home effectively, which is, if you think about it, even a smaller ship becomes his home, which is crazy.
But see, at least if you're a Jedi, you can do the meditation, right? During in the kind of the force sleep thing that they always talk about. So there's some benefit to that, I guess, and recovery. There was a couple of books where I remember where he got injured or something and he was like had time between hyperspace jumps to recover. So maybe that's part of it as well.
There was one book where he got his ship was damaged and he couldn't communicate out with normal technology. And so he went into this forced sleep essentially. In the expanded universe, you get so many like force abilities that they don't even talk about in canon anymore.
Or anti-force abilities.
Where basically he would use like 1/100th of the oxygen so he could live longer in this meditative state.
Yeah.
And hope that somebody came by. And it's just like so interesting. Like he's stuck in this tiny little ship, completely like in a coma, essentially, trying to live.
Exactly.
Trying to stay alive long enough for someone else to find him.
Yeah. Okay. Number 3. My number 3 is pod racers and speeders. So they're held up by repulsor lifts, and they're kind of like hot rods. So George Lucas was really big into hot rods, and obviously when he made American Graffiti, that was part of the ethos of 50s and 60s Central California, and that was something that drove his thinking. You know, Buck Rogers, hot rods, those types of things, even around like the Millennium Falcon and stuff like that. I mean, that it's all kind of tied together. The idea of a Wookiee was him driving around with his Malamute dog. In the car. So these things are all close together. We also saw this idea of speeders and kind of souped up vehicles in the Book of Boba Fett too, where they had those space Vespas with the crazy colors. And I know that people were not big fans of those, but I feel like that's George. Like that's what he would totally do that. So there's those two. And basically, you know, let's face it, the Return of the Jedi speeder chase is like one of the best things ever. It goes through redwood trees. It's like this really cool camera action where you feel like you're in it. And something new for cinema, I think, that people didn't really get before. And so there's like lots of cool movie effects, but also just like the idea of having a speeder. It's almost like a little scooter kind of thing, your own e-bike to go wherever you wanted to go.
And, you know, in the Return of the Jedi scene it just feels so real.
Yeah.
Like, it feels like you were there. You can talk about the camera angles and the approach, and I think that's a big part of it. But those speeders still live on in all the new content, right? There's essentially those speeders over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Which is great.
You even have Jason Sudeikis beating up Baby Yoda on a speeder.
Yes.
All right. What's your number 3?
So I'm going to go into the expanded universe for this one. There's this book that Lando Calrissian has designed and built a special shield ship. And this shield ship resembles basically a giant umbrella with engines. And it's made to ferry other ships to a mining colony that's really close to a super hot star that would basically destroy the ships, any ships that would get close to it. And, you know, the mining colony is a really advantageous revenue generator for Lando. So he develops these ships and, you know, pays a bunch of money to make sure that they're maintained well. And I really love this idea of basically a ship being created to serve other ships in that way. Like, it's not just a maintenance ship. It's actually like a transport ship for ships.
It's like a ferry almost, right?
Yeah, but
like a car ferry.
Like a car ferry, but it's like a boat ferry. Like, it's carrying other ships, like, if that makes sense. It's protecting other ships. So also this original functionality of basically linking two ships to have one ship control another one this is the first time I think I saw it. So you'd link up your ship to this big umbrella.
Yeah.
And the big umbrella would drive you and your ship to this, you know, to the planet. And I think that was also something that was really, really interesting when I was growing up and reading these books, was like not just manual control, but you can actually work together in tech.
What was it called? Is it a slave circuit?
It was called the slave circuit.
Yeah, slave circuit. And the whole thing about the Katana fleet and trying to, this was an era of the Empire, was it? Was he looking for the Katana fleet in there?
Yes, it was.
Yeah. So this is the first book back after Return of the Jedi. Timothy Zahn wrote these amazing novels, and he brought out all these like really cool ideas, like this slave circuit, and the Katana fleet was this fleet that disappeared because they slaved all the ships, like 300 ships or something together. And so if you could find that fleet somewhere in the galaxy, you could have more power than anybody else. But the problem was that the slave circuit broke down or something, and so they jumped into... Was that what happened?
No, the slave circuit did not. The slave circuit worked perfectly. There was a virus that took over every person. That's right. Or it took over the main head of the fleet, that ship.
Yeah.
And then that ship controlled everything.
And so they disappeared into
they all disappeared
unknown.
Together.
And so the gold rush, or the lost city of gold kind of action came to play, where people were like, oh, if we can find this fleet wherever it may be in the galaxy, this is so interesting. And then there's also something about, you know, the key getting lost. I think it was Lando's key. His slave key or something like that got lost on Dagobah or something in another book. So it's connected in different ways.
I mean, the whole concept of someone controlling your ship is a little bit unnerving.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm a little bit surprised that like it's built into most of the new ships. So much so that in the Mandalorian, the most recent episode,
Right.
the port where they were landing took over their ship and forced them to land at a specific spot. And that's just so surprising to me because that seems so un-Star Wars like to me that you're allowing other people to just tap into your ship and like take it over.
Yeah.
Without like a fight or something like that. So that was a little bit surprising to me.
Yeah.
It still lives on a little bit.
A little bit, yeah. But also, you know, the Heir to Empire is where the Thrawn showed up for the first time too. Now that I'm thinking about it. And at Star Wars Celebration a couple weeks ago, they revealed that he's going to be in the upcoming Ahsoka show too. He was in Rebels, but he's also going to be in the Ahsoka show too. So he's coming back. That whole book kind of trilogy, if you go back and read it, I bet you there'll be some nuggets in there. Maybe we'll get a mention of slave circuits for ships. Okay, so let's hear your number 2.
So another old school call out. Mine was a Liberator class cruiser. So when I was growing up, I was talking about, you know, you played all these video games by yourself. The Star Wars Rebellion video game was one that I played a lot. You could play it online. You'd find an opponent, but it was essentially like a resource gatherer game where you try to collect planets and build political support on those planets and build ships or troops. And then if you met in space, you actually got a space battle. And, you know, these are the old like dial-up days. So like it was very basic.
Right.
But what they found out, I'm sure what they found out when they were creating the game at the time was the Rebels didn't have a lot of capital ships. Like they didn't have a lot of big ships on screen. Like, so they created a bunch. And the Liberator class was actually one that they created for the game, and it barely shows up anywhere else. But it's one of my favorite ships because it's basically just an aircraft carrier, you know, a starfighter carrier. And it really plays well into the Rebellion's like strengths of hit and run, you know, jump in, get something done, jump out. And it wasn't made by any of the big shipyards of the day, right? It wasn't Guat Drive Yards. It wasn't Corellian Engineering Corporation. It was Soro Sub Corporation, which they didn't do a lot of shipbuilding. They did some, but it wasn't like their main and only thing. So I thought that was a really great example of building up lore for a specific reason in Star Wars, and it kind of stays around.
Do you remember what other ship that Soro Sub made? They made something else.
They made a few different things.
Yeah.
They made some bigger capital ships.
Because I remember that name. It's funny because you also have these kind of corporations in Star Wars. And it's funny, Coruscant even has a corporate sector. You know, you have all these corporations and they make these different ships. And in The Last Jedi, you know, you have the DJ character talking about who's buying what from who. And, you know, you're selling, you know, they're selling TIE fighters and they're selling X-Wings to make money. And so there's all these corporations that are, you know, the greediness of it all is also shown in Star Wars. And I'm sure George Lucas meant that to a certain extent.
Coming back to the thing you might be thinking of, Soro Sub made the speeder that Luke was driving in New Hope.
Okay.
Or in the original Star
I
Wars
knew it
movie.
was familiar from because I knew they built a number of different things, but I wasn't sure what it was.
Yeah.
Okay, so my number 2 is the many trains of Star Wars.
Oh, yes.
There's lots of trains in Star Wars, including the one that's carrying the coaxium and Solo with that old Western train heist situation going on. There's the sand train in the Book of Boba Fett recently. All these Old West themes, right? There's some really cool magnetic levitation trains that probably use repulsor lifts as well in the Clone Wars cartoon, including the episode where Ahsoka loses her lightsaber. There's a lot of them in that. And then, you know, in the Bounty episode that I mentioned earlier with the space elevator, they basically go below the surface of the planet and then they take these elevator trains. It's kind of cool. It's like a maglev type of thing where they're going through these loops. And every loop they go through, the train kind of connects and goes through. And I don't know, it's lots of cool stuff in there. So there's tons of trains. You can go into all of the EU. You could go to the cartoons, even the comic books, I'm sure, and find millions of them. There's even that bus-like vehicle that takes people from Ferrix, outside of Ferrix to the inside of Ferrix. So, you know, you got a lot of transit in Star Wars, but you'll notice that there's a lot of train-like things. And there's also a lot of the ships that kind of operate like cruise ships and not quite like airplanes, which I think is really fascinating as well. But that's probably another discussion. But yeah, I don't know what you think about all the trains of Star Wars.
Yeah, you know, we talk about the repulsor lift technology, and I find it so interesting. So if we have repulsor lift technology, why do we have tracks for trains in the Star Wars universe? Like, is that their
Like the
as
loops, you mean?
leftover?
Like
Oh,
the
the
loops?
loops, or like in the Bad Batch episodes recently that's on like a track.
Right.
And or in the Solo heist, like beyond the storytelling requirements of like putting something on a track to get the old Western like train heist, like why effectively would you have this in this universe when you can basically fly in 3D, right?
Yeah, you could move all that coaxium like with the ship between two places. So why would you do it? It might be just like an old like mining operation that was before. I don't know. Yeah, it's a good question because there's really no reason other to have it on the rails. But yeah, they do have the rails.
Yeah, they do.
I think it's probably because it's balanced in our own kind of mythology too. That's probably you're saying, like the old Western themes and stuff. So you're going to have a rail, and you have to keep it going in a direction that you know it's going to go in order to, have the heist, as it were. Okay. I think we are getting to our number one. I think we are. So I'll go first on this one, then I'll give you the final say. So you mentioned the dyad. And you gave me this idea too, where we're thinking up kind of our top fives. But I do think that the world between worlds as a transport mechanism is really cool. And so for those that don't know, the world between worlds is kind of an ancient space shared by, kind of Force users. And we don't really know the origins of it. We don't know where it came from. But in Rebels, basically, if you were strong in the Force, you could connect through this kind of world between worlds. And it was almost like this time travel device where you came through one portal if you knew how to get in. And then you could go out another portal and it would be a different timeline. So it's where, sorry, spoiler alert for something that happened several years ago, but, it's where Ezra saved Ahsoka from being killed by Vader. It's, where Palpatine tried to get Ezra. And there's actually in the trailer for the new Ahsoka, there's actually some kind of indication that the world between worlds might show up.
Interesting.
There's also, and this is something that I've kind of been speculating about, is that the Force users, the orange-bladed or red-bladed Force users in that trailer, there's a replay of the scene from Rogue One, and I'm wondering if they somehow get through the world between worlds and go back in time to try to get the plans for the Death Star.
Oh, wow.
And maybe Thrawn's behind that in some form or fashion, because Thrawn was the one who's interested in art, interested in all the ways mentally he could get to understand you. And it was also in that those Rebels episodes before the end when he was shipped off by Purgles that the Empire was getting close to finding something. And he was kind of in that space too. So I think they're all connected. But anyways, that's all TV stuff. But the world between worlds itself, I think it's a really interesting mechanism. But the only thing I worry about is that it could be overused or misused in storytelling. Any time travel device could be like this kind of get out of jail free card for a storyteller. So I worry about that. But the way it's been used so far, I really appreciate. And as a transportation device, to go anywhere in the future, the past, the present, just by going through a portal is a really interesting science fantasy type of idea.
Yeah. We don't necessarily know what it takes to get in beyond one time.
Yeah.
Right. To be the person activating it and actually physically going in. Because I don't think the Emperor is able to.
He didn't get in. He got the door open, but he couldn't quite get in.
Exactly.
It felt like, unless Ezra pulled him in or something. I don't know. It was really weird.
Yeah. So that's why I'm still very cautious about like thinking of it as a transport mechanism. Because like what does it take to actually transport something with that? Like beyond, I mean, you could say the same thing about the Force dyad, right?
Yeah. Which is what I thought of when you were talking about the Force dyad, because I was thinking, well, it's kind of, the Force dyad might be a part of the world between worlds.
Yeah.
It might actually be that space, if you're in the dyad, one of the two people in the dyad, you have like, because of the connection between you two, you have this portal to the world between worlds you can use on your person to a certain extent. But there's also the portals, the gates that are in that world, which is interesting too. It's just like, those were some of my favorite episodes of Star Wars ever. Movies, books, comics, whatever. I read a ton of stuff. For some reason, those really got me. I've watched the World Between Worlds episode like 50 bajillion times, especially the part where Ezra pulls out Ahsoka, because there's also the connections between all of the kind of the Force users on Mortis too, right?
Yep.
Because of, and for those who don't know Mortis, it's like this 3-episode arc that kind of goes really deep into the Force and kind of the idea behind the dark side, the light side, and the balance, the Bogan and the Ashla. And so it's just really fascinating going back and seeing how all these things connect to each other and seeing the owl-like creature come out and be in the world between worlds because it connects to the Force more generally.
And the owl-like creature follows Ahsoka.
Yeah.
That becomes her like symbol after that arc, which is really very cool. Okay.
Give me your number one.
So my number one is the Outrider, which is Dash Rendar's ship. And this, again, is expanded universe mostly. It did finally make an appearance in A New Hope in one of the special edition changes. But it's a YT-2400 freighter instead of like the Millennium Falcon, which was a YT-1300 freighter. And it basically, Dash Rendar is, a little bit of a cleaner, slicker version than Han Solo. And his ship is a little bit cleaner, a little bit newer, a little bit slicker than the Millennium Falcon. And when you actually start to look at it and like see the differences, it just became a ship that I really bonded a little bit more to than the Millennium Falcon. Millennium Falcon's iconic, but it's everyone's iconic, right?
Yeah.
But there's something about, it being a ship that acts as a house, a ship that acts as multiple purposes and really like retains its identity as the owner's identity.
I find that interesting. You said kind of you're connected more to that. Is it just because it was the way that you got most into Star Wars? I mean, you had the movies, people had the box sets and stuff like that, but I feel like, for me, all of those dictionaries and stuff, and you could find like something that was special to you specifically. It didn't have to be the main characters. It didn't have to be a main ship even. Everybody seems to like X-Wings, but my thing was A-Wings. I was like a really huge fan of A-Wings. So like, was that something that like, kind of connected you to Star Wars even more, was just kind of having the ship that obviously a lot of other people had, but it was a little bit something that you almost had to dive a little deeper to get connected to it?
Yeah, it was actually, I think one of the first Star Wars games that I played had Dash Rendar as the main protagonist and his ship as the main ship that you were able to control, right? So I felt like that was probably a little bit of the connection. It's like I'm not just watching, I'm interacting with.
Right.
Especially in those early days of video games, like I'm actually controlling it was this huge concept. And now we just take for granted because video games are everywhere and it's a lot easier to be able to control things. So I think that was a big part of it.
Yeah. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but I learned how to type by playing TIE Fighter.
Oh, interesting.
And, I wasn't a big typer before. I did the Mavis Beacon teaches typing and everything. But one summer when I was playing TIE Fighter, if you have a joystick and you're looking at the screen and you have to see where things are going, you have to use your other finger to like find all the keys to shoot missiles or power shields or whatever. And so by playing that game, I found out real quick where S for shields was, where the proton torpedoes were, all that stuff. And so eventually I basically taught myself how to type because of that game.
Yeah. It's really interesting because like growing up during our era, that's how you kind of learned to type, was the Mavis Beacon, those games. And funny enough, I have a story as well. The reason I got really fast at typing beyond like school, like them forcing you to sit down and play this not great game to learn to type, was Star Wars MUDs. Did you ever know about MUDs?
No.
Multi-user dungeons.
Oh.
So imagine like MMORPGs, like World of Warcraft, but instead of graphics, it's all text.
Yeah.
So it was through Telnet, like before you really had graphical games. And it was Star Wars. So like there was storytelling as you moved between rooms, very Dungeons and Dragons type of thing. Yeah. But you'd have to type out all the commands.
Yeah.
And if you were like fighting someone with your lightsaber or your blaster, you had to type really quickly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that got my muscle memory and my twitch muscles, my fingers going. I think that's also like how I learned to type pretty fast, was from that.
Yeah. Star Wars makes you type. Oh, I remember back in the day, my first kind of game that I played ever that wasn't like in a computer lab or something like that was King's Quest IV, The Perils of Rosella. It was like a very medieval, like kind of fantasy game. And they had a lot of graphics and stuff, but you had to type everything, right? You had to type like, go here, do this, pick up that thing, do this, pick up that. It was like very intense, game. And you had to get the commands right too. Obviously, you couldn't just, you had to have a limited vocabulary because the game only had a limited vocabulary. But
exactly,
it's just like those types of games when you were starting out were kind of the way that you got into computing with your 386 or your 286, whichever may be. Okay, so that's the first half of our show. I like the Outrider. I like the idea of having your own ship. Let's take a quick break, and then we'll be back with cities. Okay. So we've been through some of the cool transport stuff in Star Wars. I should also say that, again, I really like science fantasy because I think you can just like think of this wild and crazy stuff. And I think the cities is a good example of that too. And I think that these will be really interesting from a fantasy perspective, just because there's so many different ways that you can look at how people habitate around a galaxy. So let's go with number 5. Let's start off. What's your number 5?
Gotta start big. Start the most wide. Mos Eisley / Mos Espa. I have to go with both because this planet is like the most visited desert planet, backwater planet in all of Star Wars. You continually come back to these like basically the same city.
We're always on Tatooine.
Yeah. And so it comes back to the old Western mythology of Star Wars, right? There's wild stuff outside, and then that brings the wild stuff inside. And you can definitely see some of those like relationships building between the neighbors and like the community around that, but it's still this very, sharp-edged, dirty area.
Yeah. You have marshals in places like Mos Pelgo, which we found out in the Mandalorian, and you obviously meet crazy creatures, crate dragon, those types of things. So you're right. It's also very deserty. It's sandy. It's like a old west, like it's like it is that quintessential old west town. You get sand everywhere. You got your cowboy hats to a certain extent when you see the bounty hunters and stuff. So it's definitely like that.
Everybody has their belt with their gun hanging out.
Yeah.
Very gunslinger.
ready for a draw at noon.
Yes, exactly.
Well, so my number 5 are basically they're two cities, the underwater cities of Naboo and Mon Cala. So Naboo is in the Phantom Menace, and basically it's the bubble city where Jar Jar leads Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon to. And I think it's pretty cool that they live underwater, and this kind of, when I first saw it, I was kind of amazed because it's like, I was like, are we underwater? It's like this light city. When you first see it, the CGI was very clear and clean. And I think that was kind of a new thing for movies generally. But I just thought that was really cool. But I also wondered, like, what happens if any of those bubbles burst? Like, does the water just kind of fall in? And then the other one is Mon Cala, which is the site of a big fight in the Clone Wars first couple of episodes of season, I think 4, between the Mon Calamari people and the Quarren, which are two species that live on the same planet. They're both water-faring people. And the city's kind of something out of Futurama. Like, they have tubes that go between the buildings, but also something cool about that I learned from those episodes was that the buildings are actually also capital ships.
Yeah.
And so that was really cool too. Now the capital ships you see in Return of the Jedi, the Mon Cala ships, and in Rogue One, those are actually built at the shipyards, but they also have these kind of capital ships that are part of the planet cities, which I thought was really cool too. And you connect them by a tube, and then you can disconnect them, and then they can go in wherever in the universe, the galaxy you want.
And defend the planet.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think they also had like swimming tubes, right?
Yeah.
Like, as these species were aquatic and they would swim, it would basically be a launch tube, right?
Yeah.
That would push you through, which was really cool too.
Yeah. And if you saw, I think it was one of the more recent episodes of Mandalorian, they had a Quarren and a Mon Cala in love. Somebody had absconded with the other, and the two have been warring factions for a while. And so I think that Clone Wars episode really set up that episode of The Mandalorian really, really well.
Yeah,
which was fun because if you read the books and you watch the shows, that you'll get little keys like that every once in a while.
Yeah.
Okay, number 4.
Yeah, so my number 4 is Aldera on Alderaan. For me, it's one of those cities that we actually should build a little bit more storytelling in Star Wars into, because it's almost like this, what people imagine a utopia would be, right? Like, you're surrounded by green, it's all very light colors, and it's very peaceful. Weapons have been banned from Alderaan, and like, we actually don't see that much. But what we do see, we like, right? Beautiful forests, and like just a lot of, I think there's a lot of potential in that city. And on Alderaan in general, but in A New Hope, we lose Alderaan, so we don't get a lot of storytelling on that side, but we can get a little bit beforehand, which I'm hoping that they start to do.
You got a little bit in Obi-Wan, you got some in the Clone Wars.
Exactly.
You had a lot in the books. So in Leia, Princess of Alderaan, It was in that book and then a couple of other Leia books, which is really cool. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of like the Alps, the fantasy of the German Alps and the chateaus and stuff like that, but also tied with Vancouver, BC, with all the tall towers, the glass.
Yeah.
Just kind of a really cool scene, and what you would think of as like a very clean, like you said, utopian society. I really think it's a beautiful city, especially as how it's depicted in, the special editions and also the prequel trilogy as well. When they bring Leia to the planet, you can kind of get a feel for what it's like. A very cool, calm, refreshing place that everybody would want to go to relax, or in Padme's case, have a summit of sorts. So I like that. My number 4 are the Mandalorian dome cities from the Clone Wars cartoon and the Mandalorian itself. And then the Mandalorian, you don't really see it because it's blown up to pieces, but you can see the underground parts. But in the cartoon, you can see kind of the domes of the cities. They're almost like geodesic dome places, and they're cool. I mean, the only thing that's kind of weird about them is that there's so much empty space, which makes the jetpacks necessary.
Yeah.
That they have. And so, in a lot of the cartoon scenes, you have people flying around in the jetpacks fighting, obviously, because that happens in there. But also you need hover ships. You need all kinds of transport modes to get around different buildings in the city, because they're not really connected. There's just this empty space where you fall in, which you see when Mando goes to basically find the living waters, right? He has to go down in his jetpack. And that's actually how it is in the cartoons, when it's actually a full civilization as well.
So the question is, did that big space come before the jetpacks?
Or were the jetpacks invented to deal with the empty space?
Yeah, like, did you create the empty space because you had jetpacks? Or did you create jetpacks because you had the empty space?
Maybe.
Right.
Yeah. Chicken and egg.
Yeah.
Or jetpack and egg.
Exactly.
All right. Number 3. Give me your number 3.
Yeah. So this is when I'm going to deviate from like typical cities. The Kuat Drive shipyards intrigues me because basically it's a ring around the planet. And so you deal with a lot of like urban transport issues with that. Like, how do you get to the other side of the planet? Like, you can't go through the planet. So do you have a train that goes all the way around? And like, how does the transportation of materials and people and communication work between that? And I find that really interesting. Again, I feel like there's just so much potential content and stories that can be told about these different areas that's really interesting. I'd say like it's also, I'm pretty sure, the only shipyard that like goes all the way around the planet, right? I think most of the other shipyards are not encompassing a planet.
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit of Halo, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
That's
kind of what I thought of, because it was in a lot of the expanded universe stuff. It was in the X-Wing books, right? Is where it showed up the most. And so there was actually a lot of scenes there. And I remember looking it up online whenever I got a chance, when the internet started becoming, people started putting their images of what they thought things looked like in the Star Wars universe. And so you could start to see what they would look like. And I think that's really interesting, that kind of like, it's almost like a space halo around a planet. And you're right. I mean, trying to get between one side and the other might prove difficult on the planet. And then the planet itself was like supposed to be like a utopia, apparently. So I looked up on Wikipedia a little bit more about Kuat, and it's supposed to be a paradise where, basically the engineers went down there and chilled out, and then they came back up and they designed ships and built ships around the outside, which is, when we're thinking about those space elevators and things like that, I feel like if you're going to build ships that are going to go through deep space, you're not going to do it on Earth, or you're not going to do it on the planet. You're going to do it in the atmosphere outside. And so kind of this is an example of that. I think I mentioned to you earlier that I thought that the Ring of Kafrene was something similar, but it's actually not. It's actually an asteroid base kind of thing. So it's not quite the same as a halo around a planet. But yeah, I remember those. I remember them in the X-Wing novels and really thinking that was a cool idea, especially just shipyards generally. I think those would be a cool place to hang out, to see what was going on, see how they were building things.
Yeah.
How the Verpine techs
You're going deep cut right there.
Yeah, I went really deep, didn't I? Built the hyperdrives, those types of things. Well, so my number 3 is Christophsis. And so Christophsis is a planet. It's like a crystalline planet. Basically, the whole planet it looks like a big crystal. It's a kind of a blue-green tint, as if it were like a water. And you can see it in the Clone Wars cartoon and in Revenge of the Sith at the end. I think Ki-Adi-Mundi is defending Christophsis when he's killed, the Jedi Ki-Adi-Mundi. it's just kind of a cool looking planet. I don't know if it actually even has a backstory. I don't even know if it's used a lot. It's just kind of like a plot device as something kind of as a cool idea that other things happen on. In the Clone Wars cartoon, it's a place where Anakin actually meets Ahsoka for the first time, and they go on their first mission. The buildings are all kind of skyscrapers on a plane, and they all look like crystals, and it's just kind of a cool scene, I think. So it's kind of something that I thought about when I was thinking about cities. Because they are skyscrapers, it is urbanist, but it's also kind of a weird scene just because of the way things are designed on the planet and what the planet is, which is a big crystal.
Yeah. Turquoise crystal spires.
Yeah.
Which is a really interesting description of it.
Yeah. Okay. I think we're at number 2 now.
Yeah. For me, number 2, top 2 cities now is the Death Star.
Okay.
It's kind of my number 2.
I was thinking about that, before we sat down. I was like, well, Death Star is almost a ship too, because it has a hyperdrive and it can go places. But it is a city.
It's true.
It is a city.
For me, it's like a city moon, right? Is it the moon? But like, again, those urbanistic and transportation challenges, especially now that you're in a sphere that creates some gravity, right? Like, what is prime real estate on the Death Star? Is it at the equator? Like, is it at the equator? Are the floors all flat, like sliced from top to bottom, that the equator, you're all like standing looking out from the equator? Because I think in the spaceship battles, that's what you see.
Right.
Like, you see people looking out, like, the bottom of, the South Pole of the Death Star is the bottom of the ship.
Yeah.
So then, like, how does gravity work in it? Like,
how do you
what
get
is
from
the
one
prime
side
real
to the other?
estate? Where, like, do you want to be on the top? Like, how we think about skyscrapers now? Do you want to be in the middle, but that's close to, like, the energy core where the big space laser is going to blow you up? Like, so where is the most important part of the ship? I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, it's just really interesting. And even though you have the books, like the breakdown cuts, like the children's books, like, oh, this is what everything is. And this Death Star is like, I don't know if that's actually what it would be.
No.
Like, how would you actually build that? Like, where would you put the command center? I don't know.
Palpatine's throne room, I guess, is like, he probably thought about it, right? He probably thought about where things should go, and he picked the best spot. That'd be my guess, anyways. Wherever Palpatine put his throne room is where probably the best spot would be.
I guess so.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. And also the lore behind, how it got built by the Geonosians and kind of that history and stuff that they've been building out through the books and through the cartoons, and now, Andor and those types of things has been really fascinating, even Rogue One. But yeah, and I think you mentioned also transportation on the Death Star. Like, how do you get from one side to the other? Is it a train? Is it an elevator? Because it seems like it would have to be pretty sophisticated, right?
Yeah.
And you think about these capital ships that are, like I mentioned, Darth Vader's Executor class Star Destroyer, like 11 miles long. That's like serious size. That's between here and Lafayette, basically. 12, I think, or maybe, is it Oakland's 12 miles or it's Lafayette to 12 miles? Anyways, it's like, it's going across the bay.
Yeah.
And it's a lot. So you'd have to have a train. I think in one of the first Clone Wars episodes ever, when season 1, they had this huge ship where Grievous was trying to blow stuff up. They actually had trains that were taking people between sections of this ship because it was so huge. And I imagine that's how it would work. But yeah, the Death Star as a city is an interesting concept, especially since, in Return of the Jedi, when you see it, it's partially built, right? And
You're thinking about the Death Star 2.
Sorry, Death Star 2.
Yeah.
But it's partially built. And so you see all of the kind of the edges of it and the cuts and stuff, which I think is an iconic, in addition to the Death Star itself, that's kind of an iconic vision of the Death Star as well, is that kind of ragged, not quite built yet. I'm afraid this battle station is fully operational when your friends arrive type of situation. Really fascinating, the Death Star as a city. Okay, my number 2 is Utapau. And Utapau is full of underground cities. Basically, they have all these sinkholes on the planet. Apparently, the surface of the planet is windswept and kind of harsh, but they have these sinkholes because of an underwater ocean. And along the side of the sinkholes, people have kind of parked their ships or kind of set up shop. And so you have these sinkholes and it's almost like something you'd see like Mesa Verde or something like that, right? Where you have these kind of cliff dwellers, cliff cities. And so all the way down in the sinkhole, you see all these kind of, buildings and settlements. And I think that's a really cool idea for future cities in terms of if you're going to go to like another planet like Mars and, survive without heat specifically. That might be like one of the ways they do it is dig a hole in a lava tube and, build a city in there or a settlement, because you're not going to do it on the surface necessarily, but you might do it inside. And so that's kind of one of the things where I think this idea of Utapau, which is actually in Revenge of the Sith, where Obi-Wan kills Grievous.
Hello there.
Hello there, which is one of his now famous lines. I think that's kind of an example of how we can use science fantasy to inform future kind of settlements if we do ever go to Mars or other planets. Okay, number one. I'm going to do number one first, and then I'll leave it up to you.
All right.
So my number one is Hosnian Prime. And I think I just kind of like put this here because I don't know if it's actually a number one. I think I have to defer to your number one specifically. But, 30 years after Endor, this planet, Hosnian Prime, served as the headquarters of the Senate because they didn't want it to be on the other planet that we're going to talk about in a second. And, it was featured in The Force Awakens by being blown up, basically. So the First Order blew it to hell. It was a city planet. But basically it leads into what your number one is, because I feel like they're similar cities, but your number one is kind of the giant of them all.
Yeah, so my number one, you kind of can't avoid it, is Coruscant.
Yeah.
Right? It is the ultimate city in the Star Wars universe. It's supposed to be, and it kind of takes that mantle. It's just what is the word for the city that encompasses the whole planet?
Ecumenopolis? Is that what it was called?
I'm very proud of you for attempting that word without looking it up. Yes, I think that's it. And, we were talking about the traffic management earlier, but everything about Coruscant is just urban challenges over urban challenges. Having the lower levels that are just completely built over, having basically these not even transport tubes, but holes big enough that go deeper into the core to get to the lower levels, big ships going up and down. And, there's just so much, especially like in The Mandalorian, you get to see this tiny little piece of the top of the mountain of the actual planet of Coruscant. And that's just so strange for people on Coruscant. You never see it.
Yeah.
But just this tiny little area, and, can't touch it.
Yeah.
Because that would be, bad.
Sacrilege.
But just taking as, the top city in the galaxy. I mean, it has been the center of, in the expanded universe, every major government organization in Star Wars. I think Hosnian Prime kind of took that away in the rebirth of Star Wars, Disney Star Wars. But in the expanded universe, it's still Coruscant.
Yeah. It wasn't even mentioned in the first three movies, and it shows up in Heir to the Empire by Timothy Zahn, which we mentioned a number of times. And it just kind of, I think, caught people's imaginations, and even George Lucas. And he put it as the center of the universe. He went back and put it back into, when he remastered his movies to his liking, which, people had problems with, but whatever, it's his movies. But yeah, I mean, ever since Zahn kind of introduced it, it was just kind of this really cool place. A planet city? What are you talking about? Like, you mean a whole planet could be a whole city? I just have I have so many questions. Like, are there rivers still down there? Or we saw the mountain. We've seen rain and weather there, but like, how is that generated if there's not like forests and trees and, those types of things? And there's an industrial area where Palpatine and the Sith hide out. How is that, and also, does it not deteriorate over time, this kind of like subsurface levels, and like, how do they get replaced, and does it rust? And just, I have so many questions. Like, I don't even know where to start, but it's such a cool idea that you could have a whole city be a planet, and just the visuals of it from space too. I mean, these rings that show up in the light when, the sun in that specific solar system is hitting it is just really, really cool storytelling.
Yeah. And again, we talk about how many stories you can tell within these environments. I think there's millions of stories you could be telling about Coruscant, about every single level of the people that are there.
Yeah.
I think part of the expanded universe also they have like snow skiing. They have mountains that they're snow skiing on. Like, yeah, obviously in the lower levels, but there's snow, and how do they get snow? Like, I don't think they're creating, I think it's falling. So it's such an interesting canvas that you can really paint so many stories on.
Yeah. And I think they're starting to do that a little bit too with Andor and with Mandalorian, the shows. And they did it in the Clone Wars, obviously, where you got a lot of stories there as well, talking about the lower levels and the crime syndicates and a lot of those types of things. But it's just really cool. And how they design it and what they come up with, the ideas and what it looks like, all the neon signs and the clubs and the regular walking street and commerce and all those things and danger from pickpocketers and stuff like that. It's just really fascinating. And you're right. There's just so many stories you could tell in that space because it's so huge. It's so huge. You can be anywhere in that space and it would be far away from maybe the main story. So you can actually maybe invent something new, which is what this cool storytelling is all about.
Yeah. And they're starting again, right? Which is fantastic. The Imperial Bureau of Standards on Andor is just like, that's what you need to run this huge machine.
Right. And, the storytelling of people too, like, how, he has an uncle who can get him into the, into work and things like that. Just funny. Well, so that's our top 5s for transportation, for cities. And I just think I'm just a huge fan of Star Wars. I just like it so much. And I think that just kind of is an escape, but also kind of a way to dream about future realities outside of our normal day-to-day life.
Star Wars can be an escape. It certainly was growing up. And I think it's an interesting topic to look at through the urban planning and the transportation planning lens, because you see a lot of the same problems in the Star Wars universe as you see here. And so you can try to start to imagine how they've solved them or not. There's a lot of times they haven't either. So I really enjoy that process of living in this other world in my mind to kind of figure out what's going on and what could be.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Jeff, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah. Thank you for inviting me here. And hopefully we'll do this next year with a different top 5.
Yes, let's do it next year. And also, may the 4th be with you.
Yeah, may the 4th be with you.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Find us at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And you can sign up for our 16-year-old newsletter at theoverheadwire.com. And you can also listen to our show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.